That just needs to be somehow changed. The channel needs to change on that usually.
Okay.
That's what happened last time. And this is fine.
This is fine.
Yeah.
Okay, press function F.
You can try it. There was a remote yesterday that isn't here today.
Extended duplicate. Oh, let's put a remote.
This is already broadcasting, I'm pretty sure.
Okay.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Bismillah, alhamdulillah, wa salatu wa salam ala rasulillah. How's everybody doing today? All right, excellent. Any questions from yesterday? Any lingering thoughts? Yes, brother.
I was just thinking about the strategy adopted by Omar, in which you say he sort of instructed the Muslims to leave inside Syria, but when it came to Persia, to live outside of Serbia, because most of them were people who took part with that.
Yes.
If you could sort of elaborate that, I just wanted to, if you could repeat that.
Okay. So the question is, Umar ibn al-Khattab radiallahu anh instructed the armies of Muslims to, when they went to Syria in conquest, they lived in Damascus with the Christian Byzantine population that lived there before, whereas the armies that conquered Persia, that what used to be the Sasanian Empire at the time, Sasan was the name of the dynasty, he did not want them to live in the city, in Persian cities, but rather establish new cities. So the question the brother asking is why did that happen? What's the wisdom of that? And I think, so the first we have to understand that the Quraysh had relationships with the people in Sham already, because Quraysh before Islam, people of Mecca, were traders. So they knew people of Sham well. Another thing is that Sham, or the Greater Syria, what is we call Greater Syria, the whole region of the Levant, it already had enough Arab penetration so that if you went out of the city of Damascus, you'll find Arab nomads who spoke Arabic. So people knew that region. Whereas Persia was a new place. That's one major difference. And the people who went in the army of Abu Bakr, remember that's when these things started at the time of Abu Bakr, and the people who went in the army of Abu Bakr were the people of Quraysh, either Quraysh or Medina. So they were either Muhajir or Ansar. The Muhajir or Ansar. And these people, because remember, Abu Bakr did not allow anybody who participated in the Ridda, anybody who revolted or committed the apostasy against against Muslims, to become part of their army. So only the most loyal and, if you will, most civilized Muslims went and conquered and started the conquest, went to Syria. But by the time of Umar, Persia had become a battlefront, even though he did not want it to become, but it had become, and there wasn't much one could do. So Umar radiallahu anh mobilized all of the Arabian armies, including the ones who had committed Ridda, and including people who were nomads who did not know how to deal with people in the city. So that's why he told them, when you go to Persia, don't establish yourself in the cities, but but establish new cities. Whereas now, if you look at what happened in Damascus and cities of Syria, Muslims went there, and because these were city people, they lived in the city peacefully with Christians. In fact, we know the history of what is today Umayyad Mosque. It was a church of St. John's Church, John the Baptist Church. And Muslims prayed there on Friday, and Christians kept their church as it was and worshiped there on Sunday. So Muslims did not just go and take it from them because we are the conquerors, right? They actually, if you will, rented out that space. And later they bought that church from the Christians. And that's what Umayyad Mosque is today. So you can see that because these Muslims were more, if you will, used to cities or civilized, Umar could trust that they will not harm the people of the city and disturb its normal functioning. All right, does that make sense?
Yes, does that?
Okay. So, any other questions? All right, so where had we reached? Can anybody remind us? What were we talking about when we left yesterday?
Challenge faced by Imam Shafi'i.
I'm sorry?
The challenge faced by Imam Shafi'i.
The challenge faced by Imam Shafi'i. And can somebody remind me what were some of the challenges that Imam Shafi'i faced? Any of the sisters? Let's take this one from the sisters. What were we talking about? What was the great contribution of Imam Shafi'i? In terms of fiqh, let's talk about in terms of fiqh first, right? In terms of Islamic law, what was the great contribution? What's that? Right? He wrote the book, the mother, but the mother of fiqh, if you will. But there was something else, more specifically.
He codified what we call soul fiqh.
Codify. Well, codified is a word I would not use, even though you may be right about it, but I wouldn't use it. So he synthesized, meaning he brought together the school of Medina and the school of Kufa. So he, in a way, he made peace, if you will, by looking at the strength of the school of Medina and looking at the strength of the school of Kufa. And later, what happened is that people of Kufa who became known as Hanafis, after, of course, Abu Hanifa, and the people of Medina became known as Malikis. Now, what's interesting is that when we say Hanafis, it didn't really mean that Abu Hanifa was the founder of that fiqh. Abu Hanifa simply became the brand name. He was an important jurist, but the fiqh that he was teaching was a product of many other jurists of Kufa, starting with Abdullah ibn Mas'ud, including Ibrahim al-Nakha'i and Hamad ibn Salama, who was his teacher, and so on, and many other, and also the many students of Abu Hanifa, or rather students, because these were really in some ways his friends and equals, Abu Yusuf and others. So Hanafi fiqh in its beginning was a product of all of this. Similarly, Malik had even richer legacy in Medina. So what came to be known as the Maliki fiqh was actually the 7 great scholars of Medina. That, if you go and you can do some research, and there were 7 great scholars of Medina, some of the greatest scholars of Islam, before Malik and before Abu Hanifa, whose knowledge Malik had collected. And Imam al-Shafi'i went and, if you will, married the 2 schools, and out came a different school, a 3rd school, the Shafi'i school. And from there came the 4 usul, the 4 sources of Islamic law. On the Quran, the first one is the Quran, and everybody agreed on the Quran, right? What are the next 3 sources? Sunnah, Ijma', and Qiyas. Now let's talk about it a little bit on how Imam al-Shafi'i contributed to it. I talked about it yesterday a little bit, but perhaps in a hurry, right? But these are important. So Sunnah is the way of the Prophet ﷺ, what the Prophet ﷺ did. Now the people of Medina and the people of Kufa disagreed on how to get the best Sunnah, how to know what the Sunnah is. People of Medina said the Sunnah is what what the Prophet ﷺ lived in Medina. Therefore, the practice of the people of Medina is the best way to know the Sunnah. Amal Ahl al-Madina. So amal, practice of the people of Medina, remains until today one of the main principles of Maliki fiqh. And they're not saying that people of Medina are very special on their own. What they're saying is that they have preserved the ways of the Prophet ﷺ better than anybody else, because that's where the Prophet lived. Imam al-Shafi'i, where the Kufans were saying that that's not authority, that's nobody's authority. It's like everybody's saying different things. That's like, we don't know what the Prophet actually did. So we have to look at the Quran, and they had very few hadith. So Imam al-Shafi'i made peace between them by saying that, look, in order to talk about Sunnah, the best way to know the Sunnah is hadith with isnad. Hadith reports that go all the way back to the Prophet ﷺ. And so he accepted the basic principle of the people of Medina is that the Prophet ﷺ's explanation of the Quran is the best way to explain the Quran and best way to understand Islamic law, to know Islamic law. However, you have to discipline it. You can't just say the practice of people of Medina, because there may be disagreements among them and we don't know, or they may have invented other things so that they may not. So that you discipline that understanding by saying that we need an actual hadith in which a scholar says, the Prophet ﷺ says, for instance, the heaven is under the feet of the mothers. Well, who said that? Well, Az-Zuhri said this, and Az-Zuhri reported from, let's say, one of the authorities, Urwa ibn Zubayr, who reported from one of the companions, who reported from the Prophet ﷺ. That's a full isnad, right? That's a full link. We know exactly who is involved, who told whom. Now the Malikis believed, or Malikis were going for more a diffused understanding of the Sunnah. That Sunnah is known because so many people saw, so many people do it. And those so many people saw, so many people who saw the Prophet ﷺ do it. Even though we can't pinpoint exactly one person or the link or chain of one person, right? So that was slight difference between. Now later, when Imam Shafi'i made this, if you will, synthesis, Malikis began to see the importance of hadith as well, even though they didn't give up their original principles. And Hanafis accepted hadith as well, because now it was disciplined and knew exactly how we got to the Prophet. Similarly, in the realm of ra'i, or opinion, Imam Shafi'i said opinion is okay, because you need opinion, because the Quran and the Sunnah do not specifically talk about all different issues that are going to come up. But he said you have to know exactly how you use your opinion, because opinion could be just all over the place. So he said you have to use analogy or qiyas, meaning you have to give exactly the original hukm, original ruling in the Quran or the Sunnah, on the basis of which you derive your new ruling. So for example, you find a new drink in Kufa, let's say it's called nabidh, and you want to know whether nabidh is halal or haram. You look at its consequences. Now, it makes you happy. Well, and alcohol at the time made people happy. So would that count as a legitimate reason for you to analogize, for you to say that nabidh is also halal or haram? And Imam Shafi'i said, so this is how qiyas works. So you have to find an original ruling, and then its basis, and then apply that basis, and know if that basis applies to the new case. And when that happens, then you can make qiyas. So this is how he disciplined opinion. It's not just free-floating opinion of anybody, but you have to have a disciplined opinion. So this is how usul al-fiqh, or the principles of Islamic jurisprudence, are born at the hands of Imam Shafi'i. People are using these principles loosely before, but he puts them together, and he argues for them, and in this way he brings these two other schools together, so that now all schools accept qiyas, all of the schools accept hadith, And of course, all the schools accepted ijma'. Now, ijma' is another thing. Ijma' means consensus, that is agreement of all Muslims. Now, generally, Muslims took for granted that if all Muslims agreed on an issue, this is something that you have to follow. But Imam Shafi'i provided a more solid argument for why ijma' is one of the sources of Islam, and that if there is ijma' on something, people have no right to disagree with it later, and so on and so forth. So this is how usul al-fiqh is born. Another domain in which Imam Shafi'i played an important role was to change the character of fiqh from being what it was in the time of Imam Abu Hanifa and Malik to a law that didn't take into account the Khalifa and the ruler so much. In other words, he took government as much out of the law as possible, or the will of the government. What do I mean by that? Well, Imam Shafi'i, Imam Malik, and Abu Hanifa, the earlier jurists, when they would find an issue on which the Prophet ﷺ had given a judgment that sounded like a political judgment at the time, they would say that the Imam of Muslims at the time, the Khalifa, had the right to make that decision. So the Prophet ﷺ would, for instance, said in Sulh Hudaybiyah, he made peace with the kuffar of Mecca for 10 years, right? So Imam Malik and Abu Hanifa said, well, the peace that you make with non-Muslims, it really depends on the judgment of the imam, of the ruler. And what's important is to have a legitimate ruler. You have to have right government. And that's why, remember, they took part in rebellions. They took part in revolts against rulers. Because for them, for their system to work, you needed a legitimate ruler. Well, Imam Shafi'i is working at a time when the Abbasids have come to power and the revolts have all failed, and the ulama are beginning to think that you're never really going to get good government. Like, we have to work with the assumption that the government is going to be most likely corrupt, right? So now Imam Shafi'i's fiqh wants to put different kinds of checks and balances. Does that make sense? So instead of leaving things to the ruler, he wants to codify everything. He wants to write everything in the fiqh. So this is why he wrote his famous book Al-Umm, in which is a very thick, big book of detailed rulings. Yeah.
Can you go ahead? Difference between the codifying and the synthesizing?
So when I say codify, again, I shouldn't use that word because it's a correct word, as I said, but the problem is that today in modern world, codification means something so different than what he meant. Codification in our modern world means to make something into a law that state applies, the government applies, so it's a state law. But what I mean by codifying at this time is to write in his manual of fiqh, so that other jurists then, of course, study it rather than leaving it as an open opinion. So I would, synthesizing means taking different sources, different opinions, and harmonizing and making them work together. So anyway, my point is that Imam Shafi'i now began to make those decisions that would otherwise be left to the ruler or government's discretion. Now he wanted to make them a matter of fiqh. Why? Because he didn't trust the government so much. So I'll give you the example of Sulh Hudaybiyah and 10 years peace, the truce the Prophet ﷺ made. Imam Shafi'i said that the ruler must not make peace with the enemy for more than 10 years. 10 years is the limit, because that's the sunnah. The sunnah is the Prophet ﷺ made peace with the enemy for 10 years. You can't make it for more than that. Meaning that you must go to war for more, at least once in 10 years. Why did he do that? Now Malik and Abu Hanifa had, this would be strange, because this was Prophet ﷺ's political decision, not a legal decision. It wasn't related to the regulation of deen, that you pray 5 times a day. It was just that the Prophet ﷺ, at that time thought that 10 years is enough for Muslims to, for Arabia to, change, if you will, in favor of Islam. So he wanted that peace so that he could make da'wah. There was no indication that the Prophet ﷺ wanted every ruler, every Khalifa after him to make peace no more than 10 years. But Imam al-Shafi'i writes it, and it becomes a Shafi'i rule. Why was he doing that?
Because of the Abbasi.
Because exactly he wanted to provide, the Abbasids, remember we talked about the Abbasid revolution, the Abbasids came and they changed many of the policies of the Umayyads, and one of the things that they changed completely was that they stopped jihad. Instead of expansion, they focused on consolidation. Now all great empires, and I'm using this word empire, and I know there's one brother yesterday who didn't like the word empire. So empire, of course, could be used in a very negative sense. But for historians, empire is also just a particular way of talking about a certain kind of government. So modern state is one kind of government. Nomadic lifestyle is one kind of collective existence. So empire was a certain kind of government in which you combine many, many different great cities into one system and rule from one great city, one cosmopolis. And so that's what's called empire. So I don't mean to say empire and imperialism are, of course, usually connected in the modern world, but that's not what I mean. I simply mean a political system which was very similar to what Sasanians had and the Romans had at the time. Now, how you actually ruled that empire, that differed greatly. But anyway, so the Abbasids, now all empires, whether it's the Ottoman Empire or Abbasid Empire or the Roman Empire, they go through phases of expansion and consolidation. Some rulers want to expand more, others say, well, no more expansion, let's focus on making sure the administration is good and we got stability inside and so on. Well, the Abbasids focused on consolidation inside and not on expansion that the Umayyads were doing. But a result of, so there were many consequences of that I don't have time to go into, but what I will say is that the ulama, like Imam al-Shafi'i, saw that as a deviation from the sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ and too much indulgence with, so Abbasids were becoming too indulgent. So Imam al-Shafi'i was providing an indirect critique of the Abbasids by saying, look, Prophet ﷺ made peace for 10 years, and you guys have completely given up jihad, and you're focusing only on inside and your own personal luxury and so on. So my point is simply to say that these fiqh, these different bodies of fiqh emerged in certain times and places and governments, certain political conditions, and those conditions are important in trying to understand them, which is not to say that they were following the rulers, which is not to say that they were subservient to the rulers, right? Often they were actually critiquing the rulers. Islamic law all developed, as we know today, most people follow Hanafi fiqh or Shafi'i or Maliki or Hanbali. All of them opposed rulers at their time. They emphatically wanted to be independent from the rulers. And all of the imams, all 4 of the imams, actually took issues and and in fact 2 of them were tortured, and Imam Abu Hanifa was not only tortured, but he died in prison, in the Abbasid prison. Imam Ahmad ibn Hanbal, whom we will talk about next, suffered greatest and longest amount of torture in his mihna that we'll talk about. Imam al-Shafi'i and Imam Malik both were in trouble with Imam Malik with the Umayyads and then the Abbasids, and then Imam al-Shafi'i with the Abbasids. So the ummah of Islam, it seems to me, that always respects people who are willing to show their independence and who are willing to sacrifice for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Okay, so I don't think it's working if you intend it to work. Is it working? Okay. All right. So now let us move on to Ahmad ibn Hanbal. All right. Now Imam Ahmad ibn Hanbal was a student of, or rather I should say, he was a student of hadith. Remember what Umar ibn Abdul Aziz had done. Remember, he had started this movement of collection of hadith. And because of him, and even before him, but especially because of him, Islamic scholarship and the ulama all around or across the empire had become energized in collecting and teaching the knowledge that they had. So even though when Umar ibn al-Aziz, when he died, he was only in 2 years, so less than 2 years, the movement that he had begun did not stop. And the most important movement that changed the face of Islam was the movement of the ulama of hadith and the ulama of fiqh. They became increasingly more and more powerful. And when the khulafa or the rulers, they were going through their political struggles and rebellions, and in doing that, some of them were going up, some of them were going down. The ulama were only going up because their knowledge was collective and their authority was based in the ummah. And so the more they collected their knowledge, the more they connected with the people, the more and more people began to invest in ulama. More and more people became convinced that it is the ulama and our knowledge, the knowledge that they will collect of Quran and Sunnah, that is going to be the real guarantee of Islam. Now, by 3rd century, when Imam al-Shafi'i died in the beginning of the 3rd century, in the year 204 or 205. Now, in the 3rd century, then there came a new city established, the city of Baghdad, who was the greatest city in the world at the time, extremely beautiful, the new Abbasid city. And the Abbasids brought in scholars who lived in Baghdad, so it's the biggest city of the empire. And from now on, Baghdad, the story of Islamic life and Islamic intellectual life and fiqh and hadith is all centered in Baghdad. So Baghdad became the one center for all kind of scholarship, both scientific scholarship and Islamic religious scholarship. And one of the things that happens in Baghdad is that hadith sciences that have been collected now since the beginning of the 2nd century were now coming to be consolidated all together. And some of the greatest ulama of hadith were now found in Baghdad. These people now were raising the science of hadith from collection of reports to a very systematic science where they were putting together all the knowledge that had been collected in the last century. And one of the greatest of these scholars was Ahmad ibn Hanbal. And Ahmad ibn Hanbal was a muhaddith, somebody who collected reports, hundreds and hundreds of thousands of reports, and also talked about which hadith is good, which hadith is sound, which hadith is just merely good, and which hadith is weak, and so on. So this is the beginning of systematization of the sciences of hadith. We're going to see that in the generation after Ahmad ibn Hanbal, you reach the peak of those sciences and you get scholars like Bukhari and Muslim. Right? They came after the generation of Ahmad ibn Hanbal. But now happens one of the most interesting things in Islamic history. One of the most interesting confrontations. And that is the following. The Abbasid, we all know the rule of Harun al-Rashid, who was a great Abbasid Khalifa, who was a pious man, but a Khalifa who lived in luxury. It was expected at this time that the Khulafa of Muslims were no longer like the Khulafa al-Rashidun. They behaved like emperors, but also were Muslims, and they were trying to, if you will, live these two different ideals. Harun al-Rashid was a pious man, but a Khalifa, and in his time, the Abbasid Empire reached its height in economic prosperity. Actually, I was reading these statistics in a modern economic book, which is a history of last 5,000 years of economy of all these different empires. And one of the it's a book called Debt, D-E-B-T, Debt, the last 5,000, history of 5,000 years by David Graeber, which is a New York Times bestseller. A great book. But anyway, what he was he lists in a table all the great, the income, individual income of an average individual in all the great empires since before the Roman empires. And where he lists the Abbasid individual income during an Abbasid period, and that's much higher than any other empire. So the prosperity was truly great at a world historical level during the Abbasid period. But politically, Muslims were not happy with the way things were. And the Abbasids, if you remember, had come with Shi'i slogans to rule, right? They asserted their right to rule on the basis that they were a family, they were from the family of the Prophet ﷺ, from his uncle Abbas radiallahu anhu. What happened is that the two sons of Harun, Amin and Ma'mun, he had two sons, and he favored Amin because he was from an Arab mother over Ma'mun, who was from a Persian mother. And Amin was older, so he had, if you will, in his designation, Harun left that Amin will rule, and then if Amin dies, then Ma'mun, right? So this is that what's successive designation, right? So one son will rule, and then the next. Of course, the Shura has nothing to do with any of this. But Ma'mun was an extremely brilliant, a genius, and in both politics, military, and scientific, scholarly pursuits. So this is a guy who was just way above his other brother. And he also is from a Persian mothers, and people in Persia, Muslims from Persia, especially Khorasan, were fond of Ma'mun. And this is where he grew up. He also learned his ideals and of government from Persian heritage, which was a very top-down, great imperial ideals, where the emperor is considered absolute and considered nearly divine. So he had the civil war with his brother. He did not want to wait, if you will, wait for his turn. And he ultimately, especially, so there was this civil war between two Abbasid princes, and Al-Ma'mun ultimately won, and his brother was killed. Some say that was killed by mistake, some say he had him killed, but in any case, this was the first case in Islamic Khilafah when two contenders had killed and had fought until one was killed. This just did not happen before, especially in the Umayyad period. This was extremely rare. People generally agreed on who will be the Khalifa, even if they chose by designation. So this put a big dent in the legitimacy of the Khalifa. People began to think that Khilafah is becoming a plaything of power. So, in fact, Al-Ma'mun was scared even to come to Baghdad because people did not like him. So he ruled from Khorasan for a little while and then moved to Baghdad. So one of the things that happened with Al-Ma'mun in this time is that he's really, really short on legitimacy. That people don't think he's a legitimate caliph. That's one thing. Another thing is that he is really, really smart. And he is somebody who really benefited from the emergence and flowering of Islamic sciences during the time of his father, and he wanted to do much more of that. So he invited scholars from anybody in any language. Scholars from India would come, from India, from East, from the West. And in the world, people knew at the time that if you wanted your scholarship in any sciences to be valued, you go to Baghdad. And you show it to the caliph or his entourage. And if he accepts it, then that's when you get money and prestige. That's when you get the greatest, the smartest students, and so on and so forth. It's kind of the same way that today everybody wants to come to America and go to an Ivy League university, and if you're a smart guy. So Baghdad was the center of the world, and Al-Ma'mun, of course, was a very smart guy who benefited from all of this knowledge. Okay? So these are two different things going on. He knows he's really smart. He knows there is this world of science and knowledge out there. And the people, on the other hand, Muslims at large, they are religious people, and they are a lot more interested in the ideals that they hold. The ideals for them are the Khilafat al-Rashida, and the ideals for them are that the Khalifa should be humble, should be accessible to us, and the Khalifa should fear Allah, and Khalifa should at least not kill his brother, right? So there is, these are two different things going on, right? So his lack of legitimacy and this flowering of science, which makes him convinced that he is smarter than everybody else. In some ways, it was true. Then there's a third movement that's going on, which is the rise of the scholars of Hadith and Sunnah in Baghdad. Scholars from everywhere else, Damascus and Medina and Kufa and Basra, are coming into Baghdad, and this is the beginning of Ahl Sunnah wal Jama'ah. This is the beginning of Sunnis. Because now these people are all coming and exchanging knowledge, and these ulama who are completely, if you will, men of the people. They have no backing from government. And the queen of these sciences, which brings Ahl Sunnah together, is Hadith, Ahl al-Hadith. And their chiefs are people like Ali al-Madini and Ahmad ibn Hanbal and Ishaq ibn Rahawayh. These people were nobodies. Their mothers are Persian or something else. In other words, mother or father. In other words, they are people from different ethnic backgrounds whose only claim to fame is that they are keepers of the Sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ and of the Quran. Nothing else. And Ahmad ibn Hanbal is a particularly prodigious and learned and humble and pious man. Otherwise, he's nobody. So now you have Al-Ma'mun, which is in the top of the world right now, and Ahmad ibn Hanbal, whose only authority is that he speaks in the name of the prophetic Sunnah and the Quran. The Ma'mun starts this campaign. Ma'mun and the intellectuals of the court with Ma'mun, including them, were rationalists, the Mu'tazila, and other jurists who are with the court. All smart guys, because Ma'mun invited all kinds of scholars to come and debate in the court. I mean, that was a court at the time where, imagine if you put a Harvard seminar room and White House all together. If you wanted the best debate on any intellectual topic, you went to the Abbasid court. If you were the smartest guy, you would be invited there. And these people looked down upon and hated the people of Sunnah who kept away from the courts, because they believed the courts are corrupt and corrupting. So Ma'mun has, if you will, hatches a plan to show people how stupid and misguided the people of Sunnah are. So he thinks of a problem that he knows will lay them flat. He knows that and the problem is the createdness of the Quran. He said that the Quran, the question that the Christians have been asking Muslims was, is the Quran created or not? If Muslims said the Quran is created, they would say, well, all created things are flawed, all created things are created in time, will go away in time, right? And just like we follow Kalamullah, so anyway, so therefore Quran can't hold the kind of place that it holds in the Quran, in Islam. And this was in the context of debates between Jews, between Muslims and Christians, where Muslims said that you follow Son of God, and that's polytheism, right? So Christians were saying, well, you follow the Quran, which is also a created thing, right? So now if you said the Quran is not created, it's uncreated, then you got it into a different problem. Because when you are now saying that there is something other than God that is not created, that means it's an equal of God. That means you're committing polytheism. So you either, if you will, put the Quran down as a created thing, or you accept that you're a polytheist. So the Muslim rationalist answer for that was that the Quran is a created thing. Therefore, it can't be how the Ahl Sunnah, and whereas Ahl Sunnah were saying, no, it is uncreated. In fact, Ahl Sunnah were saying, don't ask this question. This question is invalid. But anyway, Al-Ma'mun says that every scholar in the empire has to sign off on this doctrine. The doctrine that the Quran is uncreated. Kalamullah al-makhluq. It is created. Yes, so it is created. Now, so he sent, of course, all across the empire, there began this questioning, which is, if you will, inquisition. And one of the very, very few cases of inquisition in Islamic history. Yes, brother.
Sorry to interrupt.
That's all right.
Can you explain again why he was forced to think that the Quran is created?
Why he was forced to, why did he say that the Quran is created? Because if the Quran is uncreated, that means it is equal to God. Because there are two kinds of things in the world. The creator and then the created. Which one is the Quran? Right? That was the question. So according to rationalists like Al-Ma'mun, it's pretty clear. God is created, everything is, God is uncreated because He's the creator and everything is created. When he started to preach, or they started this inquisition, empire-wide inquisition, so people in Egypt and elsewhere, in Iraq, in Yemen, everywhere, you would send, and the governor would ask important scholars to come and sign off on this. And many scholars across the empire, by the way, refused to do that and were persecuted and so on and so forth, including people like the Nun al-Misri, who was a Sufi at the time, but Ahl Sunnah. So, but that part of the history we're not going to talk about because that didn't create so much of a ripple. But what happens in Baghdad is that most scholars willy-nilly accepted that yes, the Quran is created. One man, Ahmad ibn Hanbal, says no. Yes.
Was there any statistic about how many were signing Ma'mun's document?
It's pretty hard to find, but if you are interested, there are some articles that talk about the best statistics, the best assessment that we have. I can point you to those articles. So Ahmad ibn Hanbal says, no, I will not say anything about the Quran that is not either in the Quran or the Sunnah. The Quran is Kalamullah, is the word of Allah, and that's it. I will not say it's created or uncreated. Later the doctrine developed and they said it is uncreated. But at first he just said, I will say it is Kalamullah, and that's it. Now, Al-Ma'mun had started this just before his death. So he died, but the caliph after him, the Khalifa after him, continued this inquisition and continued to torture Ahmad ibn Hanbal for several years. And then he died, and the caliph after him came and did the same thing, and then he died. But Ahmad ibn Hanbal did not budge. He would be invited, to the palace, and he would be asked. There would be, a gathering of theologians, the smartest guys all over the world, and they were trying to prove to Ahmad ibn Hanbal that he's wrong. And Ahmad is one simple guy who's a nobody from Baghdad, and he's saying, give me a proof from Quran and Sunnah, then I will agree with you. Now, why did they care so much about Ahmad ibn Hanbal? He's a nobody. Why did they have to get Ahmad ibn Hanbal to agree? Because the people. That tells us something about the people. for the ummah, for Muslims, it is one scholar who stands up to power is better than 1,000 smarter scholars who are not showing this backbone. Right? So Ahmad ibn Hanbal is in this time also becoming a celebrity. Not even among Muslims, actually, just Muslims, but Christians and Jews are becoming his fans. So you have some stories about how Christians and Jews would say, well, they'd come and say that we see Jesus or the example of Moses or Jesus in you, and so on. He actually did not like Christians or Jews. He did not want to look at anybody who did not believe in the Prophet ﷺ. So he was such a, by our standards, he was such a fanatical lover of Prophet ﷺ. He would say, I don't want to lay my eyes on anybody who doesn't believe in the Prophet. But anyway, that's a different story. So the Khalifa, the third Khalifa, after Al-Ma'mun, actually converted to Ahmad ibn Hanbal's position. All right? So now the Khalifa becomes a follower of Ahmad ibn Hanbal and kicks out everybody who was the opponent among the persecutors of Ahmad ibn Hanbal. And this is the downfall of the Mu'tazila, the rationalists who had, during the time of Al-Ma'mun, had become the important officials in many different capacities as judges and whatnot. So this is the downfall of the Mu'tazila and the rise of Ahl Sunnah. This story or this phenomenon, Inquisition, is called a mihna. Mihna simply means a trial. This great mihna, great trial of Ahmad ibn Hanbal, is one of the most important events in Islamic history because it established certain principles that were never questioned again by anybody for 1,000 years. What were those principles?
The Quran is the words of Allah.
Well, the Quran, they agreed that the Quran is the word of Allah, right? They did not disagree with that, but that the Quran is uncreated and the Quran stands on top. You don't question the Quran. But even more importantly, how do you know the truth? How do you know true doctrine? What's that? It's not so much hadith. You know the truth based on argument from Quran and Sunnah that anybody could make, rather than a Khalifa who can decide. In other words, this was the principle that said there is no papacy in Islam. There is going to be no pope. There's going to be nobody who can say that this is the true doctrine, that who is speaking in the name of God, that everybody must now follow. Because Ahmad ibn Hanbal, what is also very interesting, he never questioned the legitimacy of Al-Ma'mun. He never said that the Abbasid Khalifas are not Khulafa. Unlike Malik and Abu Hanifa. Malik and Abu Hanifa took part in rebellions. They said, you were corrupt, you should not be the ruler. Ahmad ibn Hanbal did not say that. He said, yes, you're the ruler. But you have no right to decide the truth. You have no right to decide what Islam is. Islam is what the Quran says and what the Sunnah says, and I am talking only on behalf of the Quran and Sunnah. Now this was the moment when the ulama, and by ulama we mean people of knowledge, not a special class, not people who have a special genealogy, not people who have some special secret book. No, people of knowledge of the Quran and Sunnah. These ulama became the top force, the if you will, the authority in Islam since this moment of Mihna. With the victory of Ahmad ibn Hanbal was the victory of Sunnah, was the victory of the ulama. Ever since, no Khalifa that was to come later was to ever question the place of the ulama in Islam. Meaning, when you say the ulama, once again, I want to emphasize this. The place of the ulama in Islam is authoritative not because they're a special class, but because they speak only in the name of the Quran and Sunnah. Whereas the Khalifa, a Khalifa can himself be a scholar, right? He can be the greatest scholar. But he will be heard and his interpretation will be accepted. Even if he's a Khalifa, his interpretation will be accepted as a scholar, not as a Khalifa. As a Khalifa, he has a right to make political decisions. He has a right to declare war, to declare peace. He has a right to give justice in disputes and so on and so forth. He has a right to distribute the revenue and collect taxes. He does not have the right to decide on the correct doctrine. He does not have the right to decide what Islam is. And this is the separation, if you will, in Islam between religious authorities, authorities who talk, and political authorities. Now, this is not to say that the same authorities can't have both authority, both powers, but that these are theoretically different powers. Just by becoming a Khalifa, you do not become a final authority in Islam. Does that make sense? Yes.
So, I mean, looking at the first 3 centuries, the ulama, like you said, in most cases stood against the political authorities of the day. So what happened in cases where they overlapped? So the actual carrying out of justice in the Khilafah, did it happen according to whatever the Khalifa decided, or was it regional? Was it following some of these madhahib, or following some of these imams? I guess they weren't madhabs at that time.
Right. So the excellent question, which is what is happening, because we have been talking about the clash between the ulama and rulers. But how is the actual, how is the actual empire being run, if you will? How is Islamic empire actually working? Well, it's a very, very good question, because from this story of clash, you may misunderstand and think that the ulama and the khulafa are always fighting. That's not the case. Mihna was an exception, not the rule. You see, the mihna was simply, this story was simply to emphasize that the rulers are to be opposed only if they try to manipulate religious doctrine. Only if they try to manipulate Islam. But otherwise, ulama were all over the place of course they were the qadis and they were courtiers. And remember, even the rationalists were ulama. They were no less. In fact, many of them were Hanafis, and many of them were, in fact, the students of Abu Yusuf. Remember, Abu Yusuf is the one who had agreed to work with the Abbasid Empire to try to keep them. Again, he was, this did not, in fact, according to, even Ahmad ibn Hanbal was a student of Abu Yusuf. So he did not say that Abu Yusuf is corrupt because he was working with the Abbasids. So I don't want to give the impression that that all khulafa are trying to do this to the ulama. But whenever it happened, the ulama tried to assert this authority that you cannot manipulate Islam in your own interest. What they are trying to do is the exact opposite of course, to try to prevent what happened with Christianity, right? When Emperor Constantine brought all the Christian leaders together and said, well, you come up with one doctrine, agree on it, and that's going to be the doctrine of the empire, that's going to be the religion of the empire, and everybody else is going to be persecuted. That never happened in Islam. That never happened. It could have happened when Imam Malik was asked to make his muwatta the law of the land. He said no. Everybody is following different sahabi. They have different sources of knowledge. Let them live by that. Similarly, they tried to do that in the time of Ahmad ibn Hanbal, and he said no. Right? So this was a principle that was asserted again and again in Islam. Until and after Mihna, nobody really seriously tried that. Well, the only exception is the Safawis later in 1500, 1,000 years from this period, but we'll talk about that later. Any other questions about Mihna? Yes, brother.
Mu'tazila, what category do you put them in? Like, if they were outside the Sunnah?
Well, the thing with Mu'tazila is that Mu'tazila are known usually as rationalists in modern, Western scholarship. But it doesn't mean that they did not. So they were Muslim scholars who were debating with Christians and Zoroastrians and Jews, others who were attacking Islam. All of this was happening within Islamic empire, right? These people would be invited to the court and they would attack Islam. And the Khalifa did not say, chop off this head because this guy is a non-Muslim and opposing Islam. No, they were actually making theological arguments, and Muslim theologians were responding to them with theological arguments. Now these people who were responding to them with theological arguments had to take a rationalist approach, because you're talking to somebody who doesn't believe in the Quran and the Sunnah. So how do you explain to them? You invoke something that is common to both. And the way they understood reason, rational system, at that time in the Near East, all of this land, whether it's Persia or Byzantine, or the general atmosphere, intellectual atmosphere, was based on Greek sciences, Greek philosophy. So they accepted Greek, Aristotelian Greek categories of analysis, which we can talk about later. It gets too complicated if I go any further than that. But Mu'tazila were essentially rationalists who defended Islam. Very similarly, it's very similar to progressive, if you will, progressive Muslims today, or intellectuals today who are trying to defend Islam in rational terms, showing how Islam is progressive or Islam is modern and Islam is this and that. They were not doing it. They were not enemies of Islam. All right. However, in the Mihna, they sided with the wrong party, and then they lost symbolically. But intellectually, what they really wanted to do is to show that the rulings of Islam and the doctrine and theology of Islam can be shown to be rational according to Greek categories and Greek reasoning. So the clash between reason and revelation, of course, is very, very important, and that's sort of animating a lot of intellectual discussions of the time. And there are all kinds of different groups. I'm going to come back to that a little bit later, but I want to go and talk a little bit more about the context in which we are living. I want to give you, in this map, a little sense of, to sort of sum up some of what we have talked about in a visual sort of way. Can everybody see this? People in the back? So this is Arabia. This one?
Yeah, just switching off.
Yeah, the one you tried first.
Yeah.
Is that better?
Yeah.
Okay. So this is Arabia, right? Mecca and Medina. This little orange here is conquest at the death of Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and then in the pink, conquest under the first 4 Khalifas. And then this green is conquest under the Umayyads, and then that's it, because the conquest stopped at this time. And then blue is the Byzantine Empire. So you will see this area was more or less Muslim when the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam died. Now this was Muslim, but really so-so. It wasn't really completely Muslim, because people had only superficially accepted. It was only after the Ridda, when many of these tribes turned against Islam, because they never really entered it fully. After Abu Bakr, then it was fully stabilized. With then, in the time of later Abu Bakr and then Umar, started this conquest. One towards Syria, northeast, and north in Persia. There were 2 great empires at the time. This was the center of the Byzantine Empire, and this whole region here, and here, all of this was Byzantine Empire. Okay? This is water. It's just a little confusing. So this is where is Constantinople, this, and this land over here. This was the Byzantine Empire, and this was the Persian Empire. Okay? Now, Muslims conquered this 2/3, 75% of the Roman Empire and 100% of the Persian Empire. Muslims stopped right here. And that has to do with the mountains that Muslims could not cross. Okay? Now, as you will see, most of this conquest already had occurred by the time, if you will, Umar and then Uthman died. In the time of Ali radiallahu anhu, there was a little bit movement. But essentially, these boundaries were already there, this conquest. And then, if you see this light green, the Umayyads continue to expand. But not too much, but nonetheless, they continue to expand here and here. All right? And then when the Abbasids come, these boundaries are pretty solid and they don't move anymore. Okay? So this is the map of the Islamic world that we're talking about. Now, in this is Kufa and this is Basra. These were two important centers. And then Damascus and Medina. And Fustat is, if you will, Old Cairo. Muslims established themselves in Fustat, and later we will see in the 9th century, or that is the third century of Islam later, Fatimids established Cairo close to Fustat, and today's Cairo, I guess, includes Fustat as well. So this is just a big picture of the Muslim world. Any questions about this? Now, as you will notice that already Sistan is bordering what is present-day Balochistan, right? So the Islamic conquest already reached the time of Umar radiallahu anh in Afghanistan. Herat is in eastern Afghanistan. Okay. Yes.
Any estimate on what is the division of the population?
The estimated population, most of the people, it's a very good question, most of the people are non-Muslim here. Only the rulers are Muslims, and Muslims make up about 20% of the population at this time. So Muslims remain for the first 2 centuries a minority in the lands that they conquered. So only 3rd, 4th centuries, and we're going to see, I'm going to show a graph of that only later that these people begin to convert en masse to Islam. Because you have to understand, most of these people are not accessible. When the armies go and conquer, you don't even sometimes enter the city. Or you enter the city just to collect taxes. You don't really go and force people to convert to Islam, because you don't even speak their languages. You let them live as they were, and slowly some of these people learn the language of Islam and begin to, if you will, translate or take up the language of Islam, and that all takes time. So one thing that we for sure know as historians is that people did not convert by force. Because if that were to happen, Muslims would have converted, people would have converted to Islam in the first century. But all historical data that we have shows that people did not convert to Islam until 3rd and 4th centuries, which is after the Abbasid Empire itself had gone. Because right now we're talking about the 3rd century, right? And the Abbasid Empire itself sort of becomes fragmented. That is when most people convert to Islam. So that's a very interesting dilemma, and most people don't understand and appreciate that about Islam, early Islamic history. Of how Muslims are ruling. Muslims are, if you will, a ruling elite. Muslims are ruling elite in this region. And they're ruling with a light hand. But they understand that most of these people have their different traditions, and they are allowed to live what they have, according to their own laws. Yes?
What began the conversion? What were the reasons?
What were the reasons for conversion? Well, part of it was simply people were getting to know Islam as more and more people were beginning to come into contact with Muslims. According to one scholar, you know what? I'll keep that question until I get to that slide. Yes.
Just before you go there, right? So was it a strategic decision in the sense did the rulers foresee that they were going to impose conversion, then the population would turn against them and they would lose support? Or?
No. It was simply the belief that white Muslims shared, early Muslim Sahaba, that yes, of course we are here as du'at, but people don't come to Islam until they are convinced. And la ikraha fi din, there is no compulsion in religion. So that played a very important role. And remember, it is given in the Quran, in Surah Al-Ma'idah, last surah to be revealed, one of the last surahs, that says If the people of the book come to you, judge between them, but if they don't come to you, leave them alone. So this principle of pluralism, legal pluralism, if you will, is given in the Quran. So the Sahaba, of course, did not enforce people. And of course, it would have been strategically a bad decision, but yeah.
So when all these struggles were happening, like the Mehna and like the ulama and the government, was there any, like, did this have any effect on the public life of the people?
Does it have, well, remember, cities like Baghdad, Basra and Kufa and Baghdad and Damascus are mostly Muslim, with non-Muslim populations, but they're mostly Muslim. But the rest of the cities and the agrarian areas are all non-Muslim. So the difference here is between cities and rural areas. Rural areas are outside of Muslims' reach, for the most part. I mean, if somebody converts to Islam, they really move to the cities. And this is one of the reasons why the Umayyads did not want people to convert to Islam. Why? Because they would basically leave the lands that they were cultivating and move to the cities to learn Islam, to learn fiqh, make more trouble for them, and not pay them taxes. So it was a losing proposition if people converted to Islam. Yes?
What is the source of this, man?
Internet?
Internet?
Well, there is this, I don't know, Houghton Mifflin Company. Yeah, it's pretty. Any other questions? Yes?
So one of the things that Islamophobes nowadays bring up is conversion of buildings to mosques. How prevalent was that when I know in Damascus it was done later in Istanbul, but was that a very, very common practice to take major religious buildings and convert them to masajid and evict the existing population, or is that?
Conversion of masjids. Let me think about that. How much time do I have? Because I don't. We started 10:30. It's 11:40. Should we take a break?
We can take a break after the question. We've done an hour, 7 minutes. So.
Okay. So I'll take this question and then let's take a break for 5 minutes, inshallah. Okay. So did Muslims convert buildings? The thing is that it's very difficult to posit one policy that everybody had. Different governors, different times, were dealing with very complicated situations. What today people want to do, of course, they want to take everything out of context and make and assert a general thesis that Muslims were intolerant. But actual history is not friendly to any kind of general statements. The general statements that one could make I hope, are the ones that I'm making. Meaning that, yes, Muslims generally did not force convert, which doesn't mean that there weren't individuals who were forced converting. That would have been possible, but there was no mass forced conversion. In terms of buildings, well, some governors and sometimes were so tolerant and liberal that the Abbasid Empire, right here in Baghdad, the Abbasid Empire, the Vizier family of the Abbasid Empire were Banu Furat and Banu Jarrah. These were two families. One of them is Christian, the other is Shia. The whole family of Viziers, and Viziers are really the administrators. And it's a Christian family. And these two families are actually sort of competing with each other, often, in fact, and causing a lot of corruption. But the point is that you could have a Christian family that is providing viziers to most of the Khalifas, Abbasid Khalifas. And what kind of policy would a Christian vizier have toward churches and whatnot? So you can't really assert one policy. It is quite possible that you will find some cases when a Muslim ruler who was either a fanatic or otherwise unhappy with something, or wanted to appease Muslim masses, right? Or that Muslims were jobless and Christians Christians or Jews had better jobs, and so there was some sentiment against that. So all of these things are real and happened, but they were not the norm, right? That's all I guess we can assert.
You said the family of Viziers Banu Furat, and what's the second one?
Banu Jarrah.
Banu Jarrah, and they're Christian.
One of them is Christian, the other is Shia. I can't tell you which one which. I think Banu Furat is Christian, but I'm not entirely sure.
And they were, I guess, employed by the Abbasiyya.
Yes, Abbasi Khalifas, right.
And what was the reason that they were chosen to administrate?
Well, complicated reasons. One of them is that if you choose a vizier from a popular group who establishes his own popular base, that is a trouble for the Khalifa. Whereas if you choose a vizier from a minority, they're loyal to you. Okay, if there are no more questions, inshallah, we'll take a 5-minute break.